10 years. That's how long they waited. 10 years after World War II ended, after the newspapers declared victory, after the parades and the treaties and the rebuilding began. 10,000 German soldiers were still there, still in Soviet labor camps, still working, still hoping, still wondering if they'd ever see home again. September 14th, 1955. A woman rushes through the crowd at the Cologne train station. She's been waiting a decade for this moment. She sees him, the Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, and she grabs his hand. Her son is coming home. After 10 years of silence, of not knowing, of nightmares about Siberian winters and forced labor, her son is coming home. The photograph of that moment became one of the most iconic images in post-war German history. And if you're wondering how this happened, how 10,000 men got lost for an entire decade after the war supposedly ended, and how one 79-year-old politician convinced the Soviet Union to finally let them go, stay with me. Because this story reveals something profound about the hidden costs of war, the power of persistence, and why sometimes the war doesn't really end when the fighting stops. In the next 30 minutes, you're getting the complete story of Die Heimkehr der 10.000, the homecoming of the 10,000. You'll discover why these men were held for a decade when almost everyone else came home. You'll see inside the brutal Soviet labor camps where they fought to survive. And you'll witness the diplomatic chess game that finally brought them home. By the end, you'll understand why decades after Adenauer died, when Germans were asked what they admired most about him, the majority didn't mention the economic miracle or NATO membership or any of his other achievements. They said this: bringing home the last prisoners of war. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with people who appreciate stories the textbooks skip over. Here's what makes this so haunting. May 8th, 1945. Nazi Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Celebrations erupt across the Allied nations. Soldiers start coming home. But for approximately 3 million German Wehrmacht soldiers captured by Soviet forces, that surrender date meant something else entirely. It meant the beginning of a different kind of war, a war of survival in labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union. From the Ural Mountains to Siberia, from mining operations to construction sites, these prisoners became the unpaid workforce for Soviet reconstruction. Now, let me be clear about something important. These weren't all innocent conscripts. The Wehrmacht participated in numerous war crimes on the Eastern Front. The brutality of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, created an atmosphere of justified Soviet anger. The prisoners knew this, the guards knew this, and that knowledge shaped everything that happened next. The Soviet Union had been devastated, cities destroyed, infrastructure shattered, agriculture disrupted, industry bombed into rubble. And now they had 3 million German prisoners who could help rebuild what German armies had destroyed. The prisoners became forced labor. They worked in mines extracting coal and minerals. They built roads and railways. They reconstructed factories. They cleared rubble from bombed cities. The conditions were brutal. Inadequate food, minimal medical care, Siberian winters that could kill an unprepared man in hours, disease spreading through crowded barracks, and the constant grinding reality of not knowing if you'd ever see home again. The death toll tells the story. Soviet records documented 381,067 deaths among German Wehrmacht prisoners of war in NKVD camps. That's the official number. 356,700 German nationals, plus 24,367 from other nations fighting for Germany. But German historian Rudiger Overmans estimates the real number could be as high as 1 million. 1 million. That discrepancy exists because many prisoners simply disappeared from the records, reported missing, never confirmed dead. Likely perished in camps, but never officially documented. Let me put those numbers in perspective. 381,000 deaths. That's more than the entire population of Florence, Italy, more than Anaheim, California, an entire mid-sized city gone. And if you use the higher estimate of 1 million, that's more than the population of San Jose, California, more than Austin, Texas. Think about an entire major metropolitan area just erased. That's the scale we're talking about. Every single one of those numbers was a person, someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father, men who had families waiting at home, not knowing if they were alive or dead, not knowing if they should hold out hope or accept the worst. And here's what makes it even more haunting. The way people died in those camps wasn't quick. It wasn't battlefield deaths, where at least there's a sense that death came in service of something, however misguided. This was death by attrition, slow, grinding. A man gets dysentery from contaminated water. No antibiotics available. He weakens over weeks. Eventually, his body gives out. Or frostbite during a Siberian winter. Toes turn black. Gangrene sets in. Amputation with inadequate anesthesia, if any medical care at all. Some survive, permanently maimed. Others die from infection, or tuberculosis spreading through crowded barracks, or simple malnutrition. The human body can only survive so long on inadequate calories while doing hard physical labor in extreme cold. Eventually, the body consumes itself. Organs fail, the heart gives out, and their families back in Germany? They had no idea, no confirmation, no bodies, no closure, just silence. Imagine being a wife in Stuttgart or Munich or Hamburg. Your husband was captured in 1944. You got one letter in 1945 saying he was alive in Soviet custody. Then nothing. 1946 passes. No word. 1947, 1948. Other women in your neighborhood get their husbands back. You hear about prisoner releases. Your husband's name isn't on any list. Do you mourn? Do you hope? Do you move on? How do you move on when you don't know? That liminal space between hope and grief is its own special torture, and hundreds of thousands of families lived in that space for years. Drop a comment right now if you've ever researched your own family history and hit those walls where people just disappear from the records. That not knowing is its own special torture. And that's what German families lived with for years after the war ended. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Between 1945 and 1950, the majority of German POWs actually were released. The Soviet Union, despite Stalin's harshness, did send most prisoners home. By 1949 to 1950, after the establishment of East Germany, all but 85,000 had been freed. That's still a huge number, but it's a fraction of the original 3 million. So why were these 85,000 still there? The Soviet classification was specific. Kriegsverurteilte, war convicts. These were prisoners who had been tried and convicted as war criminals. Their sentences? Typically 25 years of forced labor. 25 years. For context, that meant someone captured in 1945 wouldn't be released until 1970. An entire generation lost. But here's the complexity. Not everyone classified as a war criminal actually committed war crimes. Some convictions were legitimate. Officers who ordered atrocities, guards from concentration camps, participants in massacres. But others were caught in broader nets. Sometimes entire units were classified as criminal based on the actions of commanders. Sometimes men were convicted for simply being in the wrong place when their unit committed crimes they didn't personally participate in. The Soviet legal system during this period wasn't known for nuanced individual justice. Collective responsibility was a concept they applied liberally. So, among those 85,000, you had a mix. Genuine war criminals who deserved punishment, and men whose crimes were guilt by association or whose trials were perfunctory at best. For the families in Germany, none of these distinctions mattered. All they knew was their sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers were still gone. 5 years after the war ended, 6 years, 7 years. The German economic miracle was beginning. The Wirtschaftswunder. Cities were being rebuilt. Industry was booming. Life was returning to normal, except for those 85,000 families for whom normal never came. They lived in a strange limbo. Not widows, because their men weren't confirmed dead. Not wives with husbands, because their men weren't home. Just waiting, always waiting, hoping that somehow, someday, someone would bring them home. And here's the psychological complexity of their situation. Germany in the early 1950s was experiencing rapid transformation. The Deutsche Mark, introduced in 1948, had stabilized the economy. Marshall Plan aid from the United States was rebuilding infrastructure. Factories were running at full capacity. Employment was nearly universal. Consumer goods that had been impossible to find during the war years and immediate post-war period were suddenly available. People were buying refrigerators, radios, even cars. There was optimism in the air, a sense that the worst was over and Germany could rebuild and rejoin the community of nations. But for those 85,000 families, every bit of that prosperity felt hollow. Every celebration, every new building going up, every neighbor getting a new job or buying a new appliance, it all felt like moving on without their loved ones, like Germany was healing and they were stuck. And there was guilt, too. Should they be happy about Germany's recovery when their husband or son was still in a labor camp? Should they celebrate economic growth when someone they love was still suffering? It created this psychological split. Part of them wanted to participate in the new Germany, to be hopeful, to rebuild their own lives. Part of them felt that doing so meant abandoning the prisoner, giving up hope, accepting that they weren't coming back. And nobody was talking about them anymore. In the immediate post-war years, the prisoner issue had been front-page news. But by 1950, 1951, 1952, the media attention had faded. Most prisoners had returned. The ones who hadn't were classified as war criminals. And there was a growing sense in German society, not always spoken aloud, that maybe those men deserved their fate. Maybe they'd done something terrible during the war. Maybe their imprisonment was justice. The families of those men felt that judgment. They felt the unspoken question hanging in every conversation. What did your husband do? Why is he still there? The silence around the dinner table when relatives visited. The careful avoidance of the subject by neighbors who didn't want to be rude, but also didn't want to ask uncomfortable questions. That's the context Adenauer stepped into. A situation most politicians would have considered unsolvable and politically risky. Because to advocate loudly for the release of convicted war criminals, even if some of those convictions were unjust or based on collective guilt rather than individual action, was to risk seeming like you were excusing Nazi crimes, to risk alienating the Western allies who were watching carefully to see if Germany had truly rejected its Nazi past, to risk domestic political backlash from Germans who wanted to move forward, not relitigate the war. But Adenauer looked at those 85,000 families and decided it was worth the risk. If you're finding this valuable, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I cover hidden history like this every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. because what happened next required a 79-year-old politician to do something extraordinary. Enter Konrad Adenauer. September 1955. He's been Chancellor of West Germany since 1949. He's 79 years old. By any reasonable standard, he should be thinking about retirement. Instead, he's boarding a plane to Moscow. This trip is politically dangerous. It's 1955. The Cold War is fully underway. West Germany is firmly in the Western camp. Adenauer has spent 6 years building relationships with the United States, Britain, and France. He's pushed for West Germany to join NATO, which happened earlier that year in May 1955. Going to Moscow to negotiate with the Soviet government could look like betrayal to his Western allies. It could look like weakness. It could look like he's playing both sides. Let me give you some context on just how risky this was. 1955 was only 2 years after Stalin's death. The new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev was still consolidating power. Nobody in the West was quite sure what to expect from this new regime. Would they be more conciliatory than Stalin? More aggressive? The Hungarian Revolution was still a year away, which would demonstrate brutally that Soviet control over Eastern Europe hadn't softened. The Berlin Wall wouldn't be built until 1961, but Berlin was already a flashpoint of Cold War tensions. And here's Adenauer, leader of West Germany, which the Soviets still viewed as a potential military threat, flying into the heart of the Soviet Union to negotiate face-to-face. The Western allies were nervous. The Americans, British, and French had invested heavily in building West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. They'd supported German rearmament, which was deeply controversial. They'd welcomed Germany into NATO over strong Soviet objections. The last thing they wanted was for Adenauer to strike some separate deal with Moscow that might weaken Western unity. There were real concerns that the Soviets might offer Adenauer something seductive, like the possibility of German reunification in exchange for Germany leaving NATO and becoming neutral. Switzerland with a German accent, a tempting offer for a leader whose stated goal was reunification. But Adenauer had already made his choice. He believed Germany's future lay with the West, with democracy, with the Atlantic Alliance. This trip to Moscow wasn't about changing that fundamental orientation. It was about one specific, focused objective: bring the prisoners home. And here's what makes Adenauer's personal involvement so significant. He didn't send a diplomat. He didn't delegate this to his foreign ministry. He went himself. At 79 years old, he personally made the journey to Moscow, personally sat across the table from Soviet leaders, personally negotiated the terms. That's leadership. That's putting yourself on the line. If the negotiations failed, it would be his failure personally. If he made concessions that the German public found unacceptable, he'd wear that. If the Western allies felt betrayed, he'd face that backlash. But if he succeeded, if he brought those men home, that would be his achievement too. And he succeeded. But Adenauer knows something crucial. He knows that every time he appears in public, people ask him the same question. When are you bringing our boys home? He knows the political power of those 85,000 families who vote, who talk to neighbors, who write letters. And honestly, from everything historians can tell, he also genuinely cared. This wasn't just political calculation. Adenauer had lived through both world wars. He'd been imprisoned by the Nazis for his opposition to Hitler. He understood suffering, and he understood that real leadership sometimes means taking risks that others won't. So he goes to Moscow. The negotiations are tense. The Soviet leadership, now under Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death in 1953, has its own agenda. They want something specific: recognition. The Soviet Union wants the Federal Republic of Germany to establish formal diplomatic relations. This is a huge ask, because establishing diplomatic relations with the USSR means implicitly accepting the division of Germany. It means acknowledging that East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, exists as a separate Soviet satellite state. For Adenauer, who's built his entire political identity on the goal of eventual German reunification, this is painful. He's always refused to recognize East Germany as legitimate. He's developed what would become known as the Hallstein Doctrine. West Germany would break diplomatic relations with any country that recognized East Germany. The only exception they're willing to make, the Soviet Union itself. It's a fascinating calculation. Adenauer decides that bringing home those prisoners is worth the diplomatic cost. He'll establish relations with Moscow. He'll send ambassadors. He'll have official ties. But he'll make it clear this doesn't mean acceptance of German division. It's a recognition of reality, not approval of it. The Soviets, for their part, see this as a major diplomatic victory. Having West Germany establish relations legitimizes Soviet power in Eastern Europe. It's a crack in the Western Alliance's united front. Both sides get something. Both sides give something up. That's diplomacy. And the deal is struck. The Soviet Union agrees to release the remaining German prisoners of war and civilians. The numbers vary slightly in historical sources. Some say 10,000. Some say 15,000, which likely includes both POWs and German civilians who'd been detained. For our purposes, what matters is that after 10 years, the last prisoners are coming home. Adenauer returns to West Germany. It's September 14th, 1955. And this is where that photograph comes from. Cologne train station. Crowds are massive. These aren't just the families of the returning prisoners. These are ordinary Germans who've been following this story, who've lived with the guilt and shame and complicated feelings about the war, and who see in this moment something redemptive. Adenauer steps off the train. He's swarmed immediately, and that woman pushes through, the mother of a prisoner. She grabs his hand. The emotion on her face is everything: relief, gratitude, a decade of tension releasing all at once. The photographer captures it, and that image becomes iconic. Not because it's perfectly composed, but because it's raw, real. The human cost of war and the human joy of resolution captured in a single frame. We're at the midpoint now, and you've already learned how 3 million prisoners became 85,000, why they were held so long, and how Adenauer negotiated their release. Now, I'm going to show you what happened when those prisoners actually came home, and why this moment mattered so much more than just a successful negotiation. Because the homecoming itself reveals something crucial about post-war Germany, about memory, about how nations heal, or don't heal. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next part of this story series. The trains start arriving, different stations across West Germany. The men stepping off don't look like the soldiers who left. They're thin, weathered. Many are sick. Tuberculosis was rampant in the camps. Malnutrition had done permanent damage. Some have lost limbs to frostbite or work accidents. They're in their late 30s and 40s now. They were young men when captured, and they're middle-aged when released. A decade gone. Think about what 10 years means. These men missed the entire post-war transformation. They missed the currency reform of 1948 that stabilized the economy. They missed the Marshall Plan aid pouring in. They missed the founding of the Federal Republic in 1949. They missed the economic miracle beginning. They missed their children growing up. Some men found that children they'd held as infants were now 10 years old and didn't recognize them. Some found that wives, believing them dead, had remarried. The German government had declared many prisoners dead in absentia after years of no contact. So their wives received death certificates, went through the mourning process, and moved on, and now the dead had returned. Imagine coming home to that. You walk through your old neighborhood. The streets are cleaner than you remember. The bomb damage has been repaired. New buildings stand where rubble used to be. Cars are parked on streets that used to be empty. People are dressed better, look healthier, walk with a confidence that wasn't there in 1945. You find your old address. Maybe someone else lives there now, or maybe your wife is still there, but there's a new man answering the door. Your children look at you like a stranger, because you are a stranger. You've been gone for their entire conscious memory. They have a life you're not part of, a routine you don't fit into, inside jokes you don't understand. Your wife has built a life without you because she had to. She couldn't wait forever in suspended animation. She had to survive, to provide for the children, to keep going. And now you're back, expecting to slot back into a role that doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe you go to your parents' house. Your mother answers the door. She's older, so much older than you remember. She cries. She holds you. But your father is gone, died 3 years ago. You missed his funeral. You missed being there when he needed you. Your siblings have families of their own now. They're polite, they're glad you're home, but you can feel the awkwardness. They don't know what to say to you. You don't know what to say to them. The shared reference points ended in 1945. Everything after that they experienced together, and you experienced alone in a Siberian labor camp. There's a gulf that can't be easily bridged, or worst of all, you come home and discover there's nobody left. Your parents died during the war or shortly after. Your wife remarried after you were declared dead, and she's moved to a different city with her new husband. Your siblings scattered. The house you grew up in was destroyed in bombing and never rebuilt. You're home, technically. You're in Germany. But you're not home. Because home was people, not just geography. And those people are gone, or changed beyond recognition. You survived 10 years in hell to come back to nothing. That happened. Not to all of them, but to some. The men who had the least to come home to. For them, liberation from the camps was just the beginning of a different kind of isolation. The bureaucratic nightmare alone was staggering. These men needed death certificates revoked. They needed to reclaim property that had been distributed to heirs. They needed jobs in an economy that had moved on without them. They needed medical care for injuries and illnesses acquired in the camps. They needed legal help to sort out marriages, custody of children, inheritance disputes. West Germany's bureaucracy, which was already legendary for its complexity, had to process thousands of cases of men returning from the dead. Each case unique, each requiring individual adjudication. And the men themselves, many of them, weren't in good shape to navigate that bureaucracy. They were physically weakened, psychologically traumatized. Many couldn't read complex legal documents or didn't have the energy to stand in line at government offices for hours. They needed help, and the German government, to its credit, did establish programs to assist returning prisoners. Social workers, legal aid, medical care, pension rights. But the systems were overwhelmed. There were only so many social workers, only so many hospital beds, only so much money in the budget. So some fell through the cracks. But beyond the practical problems was something deeper. These men had stories no one wanted to hear. Post-war West Germany in 1955 was in a strange psychological space. The Wirtschaftswunder was in full swing. The focus was on building, earning, succeeding, looking forward, not back. The immediate post-war period of confronting Nazi crimes had given way to what historians call the era of silence. People didn't talk much about what they'd done in the war. It was uncomfortable. divisive. The returning prisoners had spent 10 years in hell because Germany started a war of aggression and committed atrocities, but they were also victims who'd suffered terribly. How do you hold both truths at once? German society largely chose not to try. The prisoners were welcomed home, celebrated in that initial moment, and then expected to reintegrate quietly. Many struggled. The psychological term PTSD wouldn't be widely recognized for another 2 decades. These men had what we'd now clearly identify as severe trauma. Nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, survivors' guilt over the men who didn't make it home, depression, and very little support. You tough it out. You're home now. Be grateful. Get a job. Rebuild your life. Move on. Some did. Some found ways to process their experiences privately, with families, with fellow survivors. Others never really reintegrated. Alcoholism was common. Broken marriages, difficulty holding jobs. The invisible wounds of those 10 years in the camps followed them forever. And here's something the research revealed that struck me. Of those 3 million original prisoners, somewhere between 381,000 and 1 million died. Let's use the conservative Soviet figure, 381,000. That's a 12.7% death rate at minimum, possibly as high as 33% if the higher estimates are accurate. For comparison, American POWs held by Germany during World War II had a death rate of about 1%. American POWs held by Japan had a death rate around 34%, which was considered atrocious and led to war crimes trials. The Soviet camps were closer to the Japanese level than the German level, which means these men survived something genuinely horrific. The fact that any came home at all is remarkable. Now let's talk about the political impact, because Adenauer's success in bringing home the prisoners gave him something money can't buy: moral authority. Before this negotiation, Adenauer was respected but not universally loved. He was seen as competent, as a builder of institutions, as someone who'd successfully navigated West Germany's reintegration into the Western Alliance. But he was also seen as cold, calculating, more interested in abstract political structures than individual suffering. The prisoner negotiation changed that perception completely. Suddenly, he was the man who brought Germans home, the chancellor who cared enough about ordinary soldiers to personally go to Moscow and face down the Soviets, the leader who made the difficult diplomatic trade-offs to achieve something tangible for suffering families. The political payoff was immediate and massive. In the federal election of 1957, riding the wave of popularity from the prisoner return and extensive pension reforms, Adenauer led the CDU-CSU coalition to an outright majority in the Bundestag. This had never been achieved before in a free German election. 50.2% of the vote, an absolute majority. He didn't need a coalition partner. That's how much the prisoner negotiation mattered politically. Germans rewarded the leader who brought their sons home. I've linked a timeline of post-war German history in the description if you want to dive deeper into this period. It's fascinating how the prisoner issue intersected with German rearmament, NATO membership, and the broader Cold War context. But here's what really gets me about this story: the long-term legacy. Adenauer died in 1967, 12 years after the prisoner negotiation. He'd served as chancellor until 1963, then retired. He'd overseen the German economic miracle, the integration into NATO and the European Economic Community, the beginning of reconciliation with France, the construction of democratic institutions that proved remarkably durable. By any objective measure, those were massive achievements, nation-building stuff, the kind of legacy that gets you in history books and on statues. And yet, decades after his death, When ordinary Germans were surveyed about what they most admired about Adenauer, what did they say? Not the economic miracle, not NATO, not the European integration. They said bringing home the last prisoners of war from the Soviet Union, die Heimkehr der 10.000, the homecoming of the 10,000. That's what people remembered. That's what mattered emotionally. Because abstract policy achievements, no matter how important, don't touch people the way reuniting families does. Adenauer could have negotiated the most brilliant treaty, built the most stable institutions, presided over unprecedented prosperity. And Germans appreciated all that. But what they felt gratitude for, what they remembered with emotion, was that he brought their people home. There's something profound in that, about what leadership actually means to the people being led, about how policy and emotion intersect, about the power of visible, tangible care for individual human beings versus abstract national interests. Adenauer did both, obviously. The prisoner negotiation was intimately tied to establishing diplomatic relations with the USSR, which had broader strategic implications. But what people remembered was the human element. The mother grabbing his hand at the train station, the families reunited, the men who thought they'd die in Siberia stepping off trains onto German soil. That's what stuck in collective memory. Know someone who loves World War II history or stories about leadership and diplomacy? Share this video with them. This is the kind of story that doesn't get told enough, and it deserves a wider audience. Let me pull this together. May 8th, 1945. The war ends. 3 million German soldiers in Soviet hands. Most come home by 1950. 85,000 remain, classified as war criminals, sentenced to 25 years of forced labor in brutal conditions. Families wait. Years pass. The economic miracle begins. Life returns to normal for most Germans, but not for those 85,000 families. They live in limbo. September 1955. Adenauer, 79 years old, travels to Moscow. He negotiates directly with Soviet leadership. He trades diplomatic recognition for prisoner release. He returns to Cologne on September 14th. That photograph of the mother thanking him becomes iconic. The trains arrive with the last 10,000 prisoners. Families reunite after a decade apart. Adenauer's popularity soars. The 1957 election delivers an absolute majority. And, decades later, it's this achievement that Germans remember most fondly. You now know the hidden story of the last prisoners of World War II in Europe. You understand why they were held for a decade when others came home. You've seen the diplomatic chess game that freed them. And you've learned why this mattered so much more than just a successful negotiation. This was about closure, about refusing to leave anyone behind, about the principle that even when a war is officially over, it's not really over until everyone comes home. Here's what I want you to take from this. The official end of a conflict is rarely the actual end. There are always loose ends, people still imprisoned, wounds still healing, trauma still processing, families still waiting. The paperwork might say the war ended in 1945, but for those 10,000 prisoners and their families, the war didn't truly end until September 1955. 10 years later. That's worth remembering. When we talk about war, we focus on battles and strategies and turning points. But maybe the real measure of a war's end is when the last prisoner comes home, when the last family is reunited, when the last person affected can finally start to rebuild their life. By that measure, World War II in Europe didn't end in May 1945. It ended in September 1955. 10 years and 4 months after the surrender. Hit that subscribe button if this kind of deep historical dive is your thing. Next video, I'm covering the story of the Berlin airlift and how the Soviet blockade of 1948 to 1949 transformed German attitudes toward their former enemies. It's a perfect companion piece to this story, showing how Cold War tensions played out in real human terms. Click the bell so YouTube notifies you when it drops. And check out the video on screen now about Operation Barbarossa and why the German invasion of the Soviet Union created the conditions that led to those 3 million prisoners in the first place. The whole story connects. Thank you for spending 30 minutes with me on this. History like this matters, not just for understanding the past, but for recognizing patterns that still play out today. Wars end on paper before they end in reality. Leaders succeed when they remember that nations are made of individual human beings with families and pain and hope. And sometimes the most important achievement isn't the treaty signed or the institution built, but the people brought home. I'll see you in the next one.